has set into motion what can only be described as a moment of reckoning for the conscience of our nation. While NAACP received multiple calls daily of complaints, since Mr. Floyd's death, the NAACP has been inundated with calls, questions, concerns about topics ranging from police policies and procedures to accountability. This town hall seeks to shed some light on these issues, community policing, and others, while opening a dialogue between law enforcement and the community. Mr. Floyd's murder is an unspeakable tragedy. Sadly, the brutality administered against the Black community by law enforcement has been an ever-present circumstance. As African Americans and Black people, we are required to have a talk with our sons on how they conduct themselves when in the presence of law enforcement. Most members of law enforcement are great. They respect their duties to serve and protect. However, there are some, very few, without concealment or secrecy, feel privileged to mortally injure Black people and people of color with no remorse. About the talk. Tonight we will have that talk with citizens of Mobile. And I want to thank our panel, great group of leaders in their own professions that are united because they know of the concern that we have in the city of Mobile, and they are concerned with the city of Mobile. So let's move forward. Let's build a platform to close the gap in a widening stream between law enforcement and Black men. Again, panel, thank you.
All righty, thank you so much. Now I will introduce the panelists. First, today joining us, we have Mobile's Public Safety Director, Mr. James Barber, Police Chief Lawrence Batiste, Sheriff Sam Cochran, District Attorney Ashley Rich, U.S. Attorney Richard Moore, and NAACP leaders.
Thank you, Amber. And we are so thankful, just as President Clopton said, for your participation in this very, very difficult and challenging conversation. But I do want to just double click on one thing that he said. We do love our first responders. We know that many of you, most of them are wonderful. They take this oath to serve and protect. And this is about, we know that you all are here to help save lives. That's what we want. We want to make sure that we're working together to help save lives. Hopefully, we'll be able to get more information about that and other topics in these next 3 buckets of questions that have been collected by the NAACP. The buckets are policies and procedures, community policing, and accountability. And so with that, we'll start each of these topic areas with a video. And Amber, are you ready to go?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Aquilyn. First up, here's a video that has sparked the attention of many, actually worldwide, as we witness the final minutes leading to the death of George Floyd, a Black man who was being arrested by the Minneapolis Police Department. And as Aquilyn mentioned, we are now about to start our questions. The first topic, policies and procedures. And at this time, we will ask questions for Sheriff Cochran, Chief Batiste, and Public Safety Director James Barber. We all have a lot of questions this afternoon. A lot of people sent in questions that they would like to get answered. So we ask that you keep your answers between a minute to a minute and a half. First up, what specific protocols are in place to require officers to intervene and stop excessive force used by other officers and report when fellow officers abuse their power and authority? First, we're going to start off with Sheriff Cochran.
Well, I can tell you last year in 2019 in our in-service training, we started a peer-to-peer intervention training in our in-service training. And we first heard of this and learned about a model that New Orleans started doing a couple of years ago. I picked up on it in a major city chiefs thing that I attended. And so in 2019, we began sending all of our in-service officers to have that training so that they have a responsibility to intervene if an officer is being overly aggressive or doing something wrong, and the failure for their intervention can bring disciplinary action against them. We have also introduced role playing in our training where, we have people role playing and acting out and screaming and filming our officers and stuff like that, so that they're accustomed to being able to overcome those attacks or infractions to try to cause an officer to lose their cool.
Chief Batiste.
He's going to have to unmic.
Chief Batiste, can you hear us?
I'm unmuting my mic at this time. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
So we too have, as part of our in-service and part of our initial officer training, talked to our officers about making sure that they hold each other accountable as part of their oath to be law enforcement officers. Our goal is to continue to look and see how we can research and see what other people are doing to maybe hold people even more accountable from that perspective. I like the idea that the sheriff brought up about the peer intervention. I've looked at that in some ways to try to get some additional information on that so that I can provide that level of training to our officers here in Mobile.
All right, thank you. Next, we'll have Mr. Barber.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
I believe the proof is in the pudding. And so having training and having policies are one thing, but making sure you actually execute and hold people accountable is a totally different issue. And therein is where I think we must practice what we preach. And I'll assure you, and I want to give a shout out to Chief Batiste, that we had an incident here recently to where an officer lost his cool. And we had a supervisor on the scene failed to intervene and de-escalate that situation. So it wasn't just the officer held accountable, but Chief Batiste definitely held that supervisor accountable, who is no longer a supervisor on the Mobile PD. But that case is up on appeal, and so there's not a whole lot we can discuss on it. But that is a very good example of practicing what you preach and making sure you're holding people accountable that are under a duty to take proper action in these circumstances.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Aquilin?
Unmute, please.
Aquilin?
She needs to unmute.
Yeah, she's muted.
Aquilin, you're muted. Can you hear us? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Same responders. When officers choke or strangle civilians, it often results in injury or death. Are these tactics allowed in Mobile City or Mobile County? And if so, why? Sheriff Cochran, please.
Okay, we certainly do not train to use those holds or choke holds or strangles, and we don't train for it. We teach other techniques of taking someone into custody.
Mm-hmm.
We can exclusively, in all cases, eliminate them. If you get into a struggle where it's a life or death struggle, then there may be some times when that may be permissible, but we would certainly would discourage it, and we look at every incident of use of force to determine whether or not it's justifiable. But it is not part of our training regimen. We discourage it, and only if it's sort of like a life or death type struggle would something like that be overlooked, but it would be examined. But again, bear in mind, anytime there's a physical struggle between a police officer and a suspect, that there's a gun involved in that case, it can get deadly very quick. So that's the best way I know to answer that question.
Okay. Chief Batiste, same question, please.
And so as the sheriff, we do not teach a chokehold or a strangulation hold as part of our training process. There have been instances where an officer may have had to use a neck restraint in order to get someone to comply with what needed to be done. But again, it is not a procedure that we have taught. I think it has been taken out of law enforcement here in this area for at least 15 years. I think the last time I went through a training process where that was a taught process would have been about 15 years ago. And so our goal is to make sure that our officers use the use of force continuum that we have put in place, and that they are able to justify the use of force that they use.
Okay, very good. And Public Safety Director Barber, please.
Yeah, this topic has been one of considerable conversation here lately with law enforcement. And as we review that, and I'm going to kind of bounce off of what Sheriff Cochran was talking about, as a less lethal restraint, it's excessive because, and I want to define chokehold or strangulation, which is pressure applied to the front of the throat that cuts off oxygen so that the oxygen is not only cut off to the brain, it's cut off to the body, and it can lead to arrhythmia and death. And so today in law enforcement, we look at that as it's a deadly force issue, not a less lethal force amount. And I think that's what the sheriff was alluding to. So banning of chokeholds or strangulation to where the air is cut off is something that probably is and should be incorporated in the rules manual as far as law enforcement in less lethal situations.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome, thank you. And one last question before we go to our next topic. Are officers retrained and recertified in using non-lethal force, proper de-escalation and apprehension techniques that will ensure Black suspects live through their encounters with police officers just like all the other suspects do?
We train de-escalation yearly, and we've done that for the last 4 or 5 years, I think, training our officers to de-escalate and train them to be aware of suicide by a cop. But I disagree somewhat in your statement is that we don't train differently to apprehend black males versus white males or anybody else. We use the same de-escalation training for all, but recognize that you know that we have different encounters with different people, but we certainly train on de-escalation things and the ability to even, you know, de-escalation with a knife involved or sharp objects. We've trained new ways to respond to someone armed with a knife or a straight edge that, you know, sometimes it is better to retreat than to try to apprehend somebody if no other citizens are involved that could be put at some kind of risk. But mostly that's with mental illness people that act that way. And if you give them enough time and space, sometimes the situation will work itself out, both whether they're armed or whether they're just acting out or something. We still try to de-escalate.
Chief Batiste?
So de-escalation training is part of our recruit academy, but we also, as incidents occur on a regular basis nationally, typically they are around the issue of de-escalation, and so we're constantly retraining in that area to address how do we deal with people that may have issues involving mental health. We talk about people that may be having issues involving drugs. And so we even go as far as trying to make sure that when we're responding to calls, making sure we position our vehicles in such a way so that we're not at immediate risk as soon as we step out of the vehicle, using our vehicles as potential barriers so that we have an opportunity to maybe to begin to de-escalate. There have been often times when officers have pulled up and before they could even get out of the car, there's not even a chance for them to de-escalate a situation. So the goal is as we train to look at things that we can do differently to try to make sure that we can at least create an atmosphere of de-escalation, but realizing that the other party involved has a role in that process, and we need them to again to be thinking about what they can do to help us de-escalate.
Thank you. And last, James Barber.
Yeah, you know, alluding to what the sheriff was telling you, teaching de-escalation tactics, even to the extent of tactical retreats, which is in the case of somebody with an edged weapon, not posing an immediate threat, but making sure we get at least 21 foot or better distance between us and them so that we have better reactionary time to choose other less lethal options. I'll also bring up at this point that officers are trained on a use of force continuum, and that starts from the presence, verbal commands, to physical control, when it's appropriate to use something like pepper spray versus tasers, when a baton would be appropriate. But officers are also trained to use or exhaust all other reasonable, safe alternatives before resulting to lethal force, and lethal force being defined as force that could cause serious injury or death. And so, again, very good questions, and a lot of these being discussed by law enforcement today.
All right, thank you. Now we are moving to community policing. And like mentioned before, we are going to start each topic with a video. So take a look at this protest video from Sunday, May 31st, right here in Mobile. as people are responding to the death of George Floyd. This moment started out peaceful, and then as protesters tried to make their way onto the I-10 ramp, we had a minor clash. Definitely was there during that entire process as protesters were trying to make their way on that ramp. But that's just to give you a little perspective of what we experienced here in Mobile. So that's starting off with our first question. What is the departmental policy on officers who have a history of excessive force, especially when that force has not been administered equally? Let's start off with Chief Batiste.
And so MPD's policy has been that we take each case on its own merit, each officer on his or her particular incidents that we're dealing with. And the ideal is to look at use of force. We have what we call a early intervention program, that if we have an officer exhibit signs of maybe using excessive force over a period of time, that we could have that officer enter the EAP program. We're always looking, there are a number of things that can trigger that as well. I mean, it can be how many tickets the officer may be writing in a particular month. There are so many different things that can trigger us looking at an officer or his behavior and how he interacts with the community. And so our goal is to always be looking at how we can see what would be telltale signs of us needing to maybe engage that officer and maybe see if there's something that we need to do to try to get that officer back on track. But we certainly hold the officers accountable for their behavior. And again, we don't always discuss what the outcome has been in a situation, but we've always held officers accountable for their behavior as it relates to use of force within MPD.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Sheriff Cochran?
A very similar program to what the police department does. We certainly monitor all the complaints, even if they're unfounded or unsubstantiated. Sometimes you can't substantiate a complaint against an officer, but you don't unfound it. You just can't substantiate it. So when you see an officer has a similar number of unsubstantiated complaints, they begin to develop you start beginning to think there's something to it. And so then we would intervene and take more aggressive action and look at the situation closer and call the officer in for counseling and just get their attention that we're beginning to believe these. And if you're making these mistakes, you've got to curtail it. But of course, if it is a founded complaint, then we take disciplinary action or corrective action. It can be the officer either did not know what he was doing was wrong, or if he was willfully doing something wrong, depending on the seriousness of it. Of course, we would terminate them or suspend them or take some type of action like that. But we take all complaints serious. And I've learned in this business, the most ludicrous type complaint you think you could believe, you better investigate, because sometimes it'll surprise you and it'll turn out to be true.
All righty, thank you so much. Next, Public Safety Director James Barber.
Yeah, and to piggyback off what's already been told is that, one of the things, and again, we're constantly having to make sure, and I find out from doing a lot of these meetings that a lot of people really don't understand what we're saying when we're talking about certain topics. So I like to define them. Excessive force means that the officer has used too much force for that particular incident. In other words, there were other safe alternatives that were less likely to cause injury that could have been used. And so that's excessive force. When we talk about early intervention, we're talking about the excessive use of force. And so in those situations, we're looking for that officer that's used force and maybe lawfully and appropriately, but he's using it more often than other officers in similar assignments, similar areas are using it. And so those are usually some of the warning signs we look for on that training and de-escalation has not taken place, and maybe they are more of a candidate for that. But I think all agencies, it really began in Miami with these early warning or early intervention systems to be able to get to a situation or to an officer before something happens, like you saw what happened in Minneapolis.
And this question, I also like some of our other panelists to weigh in. Let's first start off with District Attorney Ashley Rich. What do you think about this particular question?
I think that both the Mobile Police Department, the Sheriff's Department, and in particular, all of our law enforcement agencies, they have internal procedures in place where they review citizen complaints that an officer has used excessive force. And upon their review, if the police department determines that there has been excessive use of force to the level that rises to a crime, then they turn that over to our office and we initiate charges, and that case goes to the grand jury. So that's the procedure as it stands right now. And we do get complaints. And we look at those complaints, and if the police department brings us a complaint for charging a police officer for whether it's excessive use of force or any type of criminal violation, we file charges against anyone who is in charge or who is responsible for violating the law, whether it's a law enforcement officer or not.
All right, thank you. And U.S. Attorney Richard Moore, what do you have to say about this particular question?
Well, good evening. And first, let me say thank you to NAACP and WKRG for holding this forum. I think it's very timely and useful. We may end up talking about this more in a second, but if there is an allegation that an officer, whether it's a police officer in the Mobile Police Department or a deputy sheriff, for example, has used excessive force and has violated the civil rights of a citizen. And that's really the trigger for the federal government, for the U.S. Attorney's Office and for the Civil Rights Division in Washington. Then the FBI will make a decision in conjunction with my office about whether or not there should be a preliminary investigation. And that then goes to the Civil Rights Division, and there's further consultation with them. What you're seeing in Minneapolis, for example, right now with the unfortunate and horrible death of George Floyd is an example of how that works, with the U.S. Attorney's Office working closely with the Civil Rights Division there in that case.
All right, thank you. And really quick before I pass things on to Aquilyn, as you see, I have my iPad now, and we are following you guys on Facebook Live. If you have your questions, please leave them in the comments section. And at the end, after we get all our questions out, we will revisit those questions that you guys are asking via Facebook Live. Aquilyn?
Absolutely. And so just to let you know, by the way, we had over 50 questions for this hour. You all know we can't fit 50 questions in an hour. So we did as many as we could, but I'm very happy to hear that, Amber. So if we are able to include some new questions, that would be great. The second question is for everyone. Are specific steps being taken locally to prevent what happened to George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or any number of countless other victims? Anything specifically that's being taken in response to what's happening now? I'd like to start with, who would like to start?
I'll start with that. MPD, we run at least 2 academy classes a year. And one of the things that I guess I'm proud of, and the fact that as we train new recruits, we are putting them in situations when they swear that oath to be law enforcement officers, that they have an ethical standard to uphold, not just for the people of this community, but also holding their co-workers accountable for their behavior. And we've had in the last 2 years, we've had young officers step up and question whether or not something that they were told to do in the field was right by their supervisor. And that, to me, that goes to the training that they're receiving, with them having the belief that if they bring it to somebody's attention, that something will be done about it. And so I think that as we continue to train from that perspective and making sure that they know that they have an avenue to voice concerns without repercussions, I think that it makes us a better department. And again, it's, you don't like taking disciplinary action against any of your employees, but if they place themselves in that position, and if they place their coworkers in a position that they have to speak out against them, I am glad that we have officers that believe enough in the process here that they will speak up and speak out.
Thank you. Who'd like to go next?
Well, I would say the same thing. The question about what are we doing to prevent it, I think it's incorporated in our training and our rules and regulations. It's already there to prevent something that happened like in Minneapolis. But we continually stress and go over it over and over in our training in the Mobile County Sheriff's Office. every deputy sheriff goes through in-service training for a week every year. And we'll take some of these hot button items that be part of the training. We always incorporate, I guess you'd say, the latest trends and challenges that we have, but we also recertify them in other things of use of force or less lethal force and things of that nature. But on a additional note, all of our supervisors, once a year, we're blessed with the opportunity to go out to Camp Grace, and we have a 3-day retreat where we mix all of our supervisors together between the Metro Jail supervisors and our deputy sheriffs in the sheriff's office, and we spend 3 days on these same topics that are current trends and current events. And so we teach, and I think we've been able to determine and had a lot of people step up to report misconduct on others. In fact, I think it's a trend that we see more and more today than we did 10 years ago, or certainly 20 years ago, or even I can go back many, many years. But the trend is there that officers now are taking a more proactive approach to report misconduct on the part of a fellow officer.
Thank you so much. We appreciate that. And in light of time, we actually would like to probably move on to a couple of questions for Attorney Moore.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Like Aquilin just mentioned, my next question is for Attorney Moore. What will you do to promote racial healing in our community?
So I think, first of all, we have to have an appreciation for the level of distrust in our minority communities that exist. To a certain extent, it's hard to gauge that. Of the police and law enforcement generally, and I count myself in that group. And so, because there's been this breach of trust between law enforcement and certain segments of our population in our district, we need to figure out how to listen to each other. There is a gap in the perception of whether or not law enforcement is fair to African Americans, for example, as opposed to white citizens. And because there is that perception, whether it's reality or not, we need to all come to the table. My intent as U.S. Attorney, the U.S. Attorney has a good bit of authority in terms of convening people. I intend to ask people to come to the table with me and express their views about this gap. And to the extent that we can find a better way to do what we've been doing, and I think our law enforcement partners here actually do a great job, but we shouldn't grade our own test, okay? We should not grade our own test. We need to be open to the feedback we get from the community, and I intend to do that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And just in about a minute, kind of a short answer, please, just to follow up on that question. If determined that the use of deadly force was unwarranted by federal guidelines, what further involvement does the U.S. Attorney have in this case?
Well, I alluded to that earlier. I think I covered that, but I'll just say this again. If it comes to our attention that there is an allegation that a citizen in our federal district, it's the Southern District of Alabama, 13 counties, has had their civil rights violated, we will confer with the FBI and talk about whether an investigation should be done by the FBI. The FBI will make a recommendation to the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice, and then we will determine whether or not the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Civil Rights Division brings charges, criminal or civil, and then we will work together. And again, as I mentioned, that is what is happening in Minneapolis, Minnesota. U.S. Attorney's Office is working with the Civil Rights Division to prosecute that case.
All right, and I just wanted to hop in one more second because our President Clopton may interject here and there, just to let you know. So I don't know if you wanted to say something on this point, President, or?
No. I heard it earlier when USA Moore mentioned especially with the civil rights aspect of it. But if I look back and go back to the apprehension techniques, and I'd like to address one of the responses. One of the responses was from Sheriff Cochran as to apprehension techniques and the utilization of them on all people. But the reason that the words Black people were used is those are the ones that we're seeing that are being killed with the chokeholds up to a chokehold with a knee. And that's why that question was submitted in that particular context. Also, we talk about the recertification, and there's some other parts to it. And it goes on to the training reports. If we have time, we'll come back to that particular question. Thank you, Echo.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. We're going to actually move on to the next topic, but first we want to play this video right quick. This last video showcases the officers involved have been charged with George Floyd's death. Former officer Derek Chauvin had his knee on Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes. He has been charged with second-degree murder. Floyd's co-workers, rookies Thomas Lane and J. Alexander Ewing, they were actually on their 4th day as an officer, and total are all charged as accomplices. Moving forward to our next topic, accountability. Our first question is actually for all of you. Does Mobile have a citizens review board? If so, what's the selection process for members? Let's start off with Chief Batiste.
Why you would go there? So, you know, several years back, there was a, that we did put together an informal citizen review board. So we have two. We have one that MPD went out and we built a relationship with community leaders here in the city of Mobile that we believe had credibility with the community, and we talked to them, and they sit at the table with us even today. It's been something that was actually put in place when Director Barber was the chief. And but we still maintain that relationship with that group of individuals simply because it gives us an opportunity to leverage our ability to reach out to the community in difficult times like we're dealing with right now, to make sure that we have an idea of what the pulse of the community happens to be, to make sure that the legitimacy of who we are as a department is being shared beyond the department by people other than us. And then of course, ultimately is we're not always grading our own tests, as the U.S. Attorney Moore said. We're getting feedback from the community about how we're doing and what we're not doing. There wasn't an effort to put together a citizen review board that it functioned, but I think what happened and what I saw happen in the short period of time that they worked was, as they began to see the legitimacy of what we were trying to do as a department, people began to question their legitimacy. And so they thought that they were being brainwashed by the police. And so the ideal is this, is that, you know, we are who we are. Some of the things that have happened in law enforcement, we've earned. And we've admitted that we've earned some of the things that have happened in law enforcement. But ultimately, we want to be as transparent as we possibly can with the community. And we only ask that the community be receptive to listening to both sides of anything that takes place whenever something happens in our community.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Public Safety Director James Barber, would you like to jump in on that?
Yeah, I'll be glad to, and kind of like to build off of what Chief Batiste is talking about. The secondary board he was referring to is not one selected by the police chief or me, but by the city council, each district having a representative as well as the mayor that sat on an advisory board for police. That happened about 4 years ago, but since then it's disbanded. But I see there's an effort now to reestablish that advisory board that was established by ordinance. Going back to the community leadership, which we to give you an example, the president of NAACP at the time was Ronald Ali, who continues to participate in this particular board, is to review police tactics and strategies. And the reason that is so important is a lot of the perception about heavy police presence and heavy police activity in Black neighborhoods. And so, or inappropriate police tactics, I guess would be the best way. And so making sure that we're reviewing our tactics and that we are targeting criminals or any place that is used to facilitate criminal activity and not a neighborhood. And so that's been very important to us as we review those tactics. It's been very helpful to us to be able to see from a different perspective how other people view that police car when it turns onto their street. So
if I may say so, the other parts of that question should not be answered. They're not valid and not responsive because of the fact, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Citizen Advisory Board has been disbanded. Is that correct?
Yes, the one created by ordinance by the city council, and that was probably, I believe it was in 2016, hasn't been disbanded. The ordinance is still there, but that advisory board kind of disbanded on its own. It kind of faded away. The members that were selected by council eventually just quit coming to meetings, and then the meeting ceased. And so I do know that they are beginning the process of reappointing membership to that advisory council. But along with Chief Batiste, the most effective ones that we have worked with have been those from the very communities that feel most disenfranchised. And so we continue to do that. There was a meeting last Thursday, for example, with Chief Batiste and quite a few of these leaders that are in the very communities that feel the most disenfranchised about not only what we're seeing in Minneapolis, but how we're doing as Mobile PD and what we can do better in order to work with the community rather than being seen as some type of occupying force in those neighborhoods.
Thank you. Move on along to DA Rich, please.
Yes, sir. At the DA's office, we have every month of each year, we have a grand jury. The grand jury is comprised of 18 members of the community that are chosen randomly by their driver's license number when they appear for jury duty. Those 18 citizens serve in the DA's office for 2 weeks, hearing cases, hearing any felony or misdemeanor that would go to circuit court to determine if the DA's office has enough evidence to move forward with the case or whether a case should stop or end and be no-billed in the grand jury. This is the system of checks and balances that is in place and happens every single month at the Mobile County District Attorney's Office. And I think that is very important that the community, everybody understands that these are not chosen by the DA's office. These are chosen completely randomly, members of the community, to represent the community for a 2-week period each month to make sure that they review everything that we are doing with moving cases forward.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Thank you. And next we have a question from Aquilin, so I'm gonna turn things over to you.
Sure. So question for District Attorney Rich. Thank you for being right there. So our plans being developed to ensure that the DA's office is reflective of the racial makeup of Mobile so that, that all citizens will be represented.
You know, I'll have to tell you a little bit of history about the DA's office. I started 22 years ago here as an assistant district attorney. My starting salary was $26,000 a year. When I took over as the elected DA in 2011, the starting salary for a licensed attorney fresh out of law school was $45,000 a year. I then had to, we were completely underfunded at the office. I had a lengthy battle with the county commission. They stepped up to the plate and gave us additional funding. And so currently, for the last 4 years, the starting salary at the Mobile County District Attorney's Office is $55,000 a year for a licensed attorney. What is really sad about that is that the average person coming out of law school has a student loan debt of $100,000 or greater. And it's virtually impossible to keep and retain employees that are making a starting salary of $55,000 a year when they have $100,000 or more of student debt. We do our very best. We recruit from all of the southern law schools, not only in Alabama, but in Mississippi, as well as we recruit We go to the National Black Prosecutors Association's annual meeting, national annual meeting, and they have a job fair, and we go and recruit from that on a national level. We do our very best to employ the highest quality employees. Unfortunately, they can get much better pay at a private law firm than they can working as a public prosecutor.
Are you saying that you've actually tried to hire more minorities and they've not taken the offer? They've gone elsewhere? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. And we have minorities who have absolutely come to work here, just as we have a lot of young people come to this office to get training, because they have zero experience when they come out of law school. And so oftentimes, and it's a trend everywhere in prosecution offices, they go to the prosecutor's office to get trial experience, because they can get that very quickly at a prosecutor's office. But oftentimes they only stay 3 or 4 years. Once they get 3 or 4 years of trial experience under their belt, they're much more valuable again in the private sector because they have trial experience. And so they're swooped up. And I'm a training ground, unfortunately, for a lot of lawyers, especially young lawyers in our office. But we do our best to recruit African-American candidates every day, and we will continue to do that.
Please do. We appreciate that. Please do. Amber?
All right, thank you. My last question for this particular topic. Last week, protesters were arrested. During the bail process, they were informed that the computers were down, so they had to remain in jail an extra day. What can be done to prevent this from happening again in the future? Let's start off with Sheriff Cochran.
Well, first off, that's not true. The reason they remained in jail, not because of the computer, but because the city magistrates wanted to have their own bond hearing rather than a preset bond. So they were held over in jail until such time as they appeared before the judge. The judge then set bonds on them. And when the bonds were set, if they had a bonding company that wanted to make the bond, then they were allowed to bond out. But we did have a computer glitch during that time. We had to work manually, but it did not prevent someone from having a bond. They were not given a bond because the magistrates wanted the people that were charged with civil disobedience to appear before them. And that did not occur until Monday and Wednesday when the city magistrates hold court.
Sheriff, it's Robert Clopton. Is that a normal procedure for the magistrate to demand that?
I would say not a normal procedure. It doesn't happen very often, but it can happen. And so in the course of, and of course the DAs involved here can speak to the legal manufacturer, but when someone is arrested, they can be held for up to 72 hours without any kind of bond whatsoever. And in this case, they were not held that long. But I think because some of them that had been arrested for violating the law had been at a protest, I think that they may have thought there being protesters would be able to get arrested, come to jail, and make a quick bond and get out. And that just did not happen. But it had nothing to do with the computer glitch. And we were not holding anybody unlawfully. We were just holding them for the magistrates.
Well, I'll hold that question for later, maybe a comment. We're running out of time. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Mr. Clopton, can I jump in on this?
Yes.
Okay, and again, Public Safety Director, this actually came about, if you remember when the COVID-19 stuff all started, we actually were trying to avoid any kind of custodial arrest, and we actually tried to do that during civil disorder as well. And so we created a summons, more catch and release type process for nonviolent felony or misdemeanor issues. And during the disorder that we were seeing throughout the country and here in Mobile, it was me that had those discussions with the courts that we were going to bypass those protocols on the civil disorder cases, because the last thing we wanted to do is have somebody that's throwing at the police or willful destruction of property be returned right back into the crowd that's in continuing to agitate. And so we did ask in the Alabama Rules of Criminal Procedure, and I think the district attorney can weigh in on this, it is required upon us that anybody that is arrested has to have a court appearance within 72 hours in front of a judge. And so rather than use the summons or use any ticketing or catch and release type process, in order to make sure we were able to maintain order, we did ask that we require a court appearance in front of a judge so that conditions of release can be set, and that, a bail would be given at that point. And so the rest of the city, non-disorder related, is still in the summons, or we try to avoid. But on the civil disorder side, we did require court appearance within 72 hours. And I think most of them actually occurred in 48.
And they have both cited the law correctly, so there's really nothing that I can add to that.
Okay, thank you very much. Can we go on down to general questions? We have two questions that under the general questions that we need to, they have been requested again. And so we need some closure there.
Absolutely, I can go ahead with that first question. The NAACP has been contacted repeatedly for help with obtaining an ankle monitor after making bail, but they were told that the monitors were not available. What is the process of attaining an ankle monitor after bail?
I can say that that is a process that the defendant has told to report to either community corrections or state probation office. And it is the community corrections officer or the state probation officer who is responsible for setting that up once it's ordered by the court that someone be placed on an ankle monitor. And they are the two entities that monitor ankle monitoring within our community.
Okay, thank you. And one last question, maybe you can answer this, Ms. Rich, but why do we currently have a waiting list for ankle monitors?
That is definitely a question I cannot answer. I was told that ankle monitors were not being placed on anyone due to COVID-19. But again, I have no authority over ankle monitors, and my office has nothing to do with ankle monitors. That is a procedure that is ordered by the court and is implemented by either community corrections, jail diversion, or the state probation office. We don't have anything to do with ankle monitors.
Thank you. Aquilin?
Sure, and just to that question, Sheriff Cochran or Director Barber, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I think Ms. Rich said that, the ankle monitors is at the discretion of the court. There's no law that requires people or allows people to have ankle monitors in lieu of being in jail or making bond. I would just simply add that we're in the process of acquiring some ankle bracelets and are trying to create a program where we can go to the judges and ask them in certain cases, would you allow us to let this defendant out on this ankle bracelet so we can send them home and get them out of jail? But that's where we've just started it with a small grant we had. We're wanting to pilot a program to see if that would be a workable solution, but it's more proactive on our part and not that the defendants have any right to an ankle bracelet to get out of jail.
Okay.
With all due respect, it's not a right. It was the judge released him after they had went through the bail and bonding process. The requirement was to have an ankle bracelet, monitor, and those were not available at the time. But we'll move on and come back to that at a later time. Thank you very much, DA Rich and Sheriff.
Thank you. And in last question that on this part, are functioning body cameras considered an inalienable part of the law enforcement uniform? If not, why not? And if so, are there consequences for this kind of uniform violation that amounts to a severe breach in public trust? Sheriff Cochran, would you like to start with that and try in about a minute or so?
I don't really quite the inalienable statement in there, but body cameras are not required by law or anything like that. In the state of Alabama, we do not have a state law that regulates the usage of them, the recording of them, the storage of the stuff, the release of it, and all like that. Mm-hmm. And as such, we do not participate in a body camera program at the sheriff's office. When and if the state fixes that, then we'll take a closer look. But I will tell you that I don't think that we've had any citizen make an official citizen complaint that we've not been able to resolve to the favor of the citizen in a misconduct complaint. There are other ways to investigate. And of course, you see so many people take video anytime there's an arrest being made. We find other people have video, but we have physical evidence, statements by all involved, and we utilize the polygraph exams to get to the bottom of it. And I just don't see that at this time it's a necessary thing that we have.
Okay, and I think what I heard you say towards the beginning of that was reaching out to the state to fix it. So are you saying that you think it's something that should be fixed? Because the last part sounds like you don't believe that's necessary.
Well, if we don't have a law that tells us how we're to administer it, the public safety director and the chief of police and I both for the last 2 years have tried to get the state legislators to pass a model law that would then regulate how and when the footage is released and how it's kept and who has access to it and all like that. But again, it makes for great TV video and stuff, but it's just not proven to be that beneficial in my opinion.
Okay, well, maybe we can help in some way, shape, or form.
I wish you could.
We'll try. I have no idea. And how about Public Safety Director Barber or Chief Batiste? Would you like to respond to that about the body cameras?
You know, I did want to respond to the legislation and why it's so necessary, and if the NAACP is interested in taking a look at the legislation. We certainly think that anybody that's been recorded, either their audio or visually on the body cam, should have some standing to be able to review that. And so, but what we also disagree with from a law enforcement standpoint, that everybody should have access to your arrest. I mean, so, you know, the body cam video, it's very difficult for us to get people to talk to us about a crime as it is, much less if they thought that witness's statement was going to show up on the 6 o'clock news. And so there's a lot of concerns about the privacy and safety of individuals. We have images of children. We've got images of suspects that are not guilty yet. And we've also got images of, you know, victims in very, sometimes, you know, bad situations, domestics. And so, but people that have standing, if you've been recorded or your voice has been recorded, there should be an option for that without having to release it to everybody. Because I can tell you that if we had to release, we've got 500 police officers in Mobile. If we had to release 24 hours of video, 7 days a week, you know, you could see where we'd have to shut the program down. And we've seen that happen in Seattle, Washington, where they could not keep up with it and just had to take up the body camera. So don't take it away from us as a tool. But let's make sure that we're very thoughtful in the privacy of individuals that are on there and how it impacts law enforcement's ability to have the cooperation of the citizens that know, in the confidence that they're not going to be shown to the public with that cooperation. So that's where I speak. I'll let Chief Batiste speak to our policies as far as, yes, it is part of their uniform. Yes, they are to wear it. And yes, there are consequences for intentionally not using that piece of equipment.
Really quick before Chief Batiste answer, I have a question from a media standpoint. I know that we are running close to that 7 o'clock hour and a lot of people will be jumping off, but what can we do as the media to assist you all with this community building and move things forward?
I mean, I'll take that on. I mean, one of the things you're doing is you are doing it. What we need are dialogue, not rocks and bottles, and we need to all learn to sit down and instead of talking about each other, instead of talking at each other, to really sit down and have dialogue to where we talk to each other. Because I've always said, if we can learn to look beyond the color of skin and beyond the uniform and have that dialogue, we will all find out that we are far more alike than we are different. And so it's very important that we do this. It's very important that we continue to do it and that we work through these issues, build legitimacy and trust with the public, and allow law enforcement, and Mr. Clopton brought this up. There are a lot of really great police officers out here, but we do have bad in every profession. But let's deal with the bad ones. Let's hold them accountable. You have bad doctors. It doesn't mean you quit going to the doctor. So let's hold the accountability. Let's make sure that we're doing what we can as a profession. We hear this thing about defund the police. Actually, it's counterintuitive to what should be happening. We should be increasing the funding to the police so that we can increase the quality of police officers, the training of police officers, the equipping, and then retaining police officers. Because I think Chief Batiste will tell you that we are losing 60 police officers a year. And then when you have an environment like this, the recruiting of qualified candidates becomes very difficult.
All right, thank you. Chief Batiste, we'll have to come back to you at a later time.
Fine.
So in our last statement here, just in closing words, what are your final thoughts in terms of where do we go from here? If you can, each of you share about, 30 seconds to a minute of where do we go from here? Let's start with DA Rich. Would you please start?
Sure. One of the programs that we've implemented is we are real heavy on social media at the DA's office because we think the public needs to know exactly what's going on, and there'd be the public know when something is happening in court, when someone's getting sentenced, when someone's on trial, all of those things. Communication has been said numerous times here tonight. Communication is the key. Communication to the public about what actually is going on, because oftentimes most people don't know what happens at the courthouse unless it directly affects them. But more people need to understand what is going on at the courthouse and what we are doing at the Mobile County DA's office. And I'd just like to add, one of the things that's so important is any officer involved use of force, excessive use of force, is presented to a mobile grand jury. Most people don't realize that. And I think that's very important. All officers know that if they are involved in a situation where there is a death, God forbid, that is also presented to a Mobile County grand jury. And there are 18 members of the community that review the facts and circumstances surrounding that. And that is very, very important. But to me, in closing, I just think that communication and open lines of communication, I've had that very discussion with Mr. Clopton over the last 6 months, it is important. And information being given to the public is so very important.
And I definitely hear you. How about you, Chief Batiste? Would you tell us where do we go from here in about 30 seconds to a minute?
So in about 30 seconds or less is, where we go from here is continue to have dialogue. I think Director Barber said it earlier. We need to continue to communicate with one another. We need to make sure that we're listening twice as hard as we're talking, making sure we're hearing what the people that are sitting across the table or in the room with us are saying, and not be trying to give them an explanation before we even hear what the concern happens to be. And so that's what we're going to continue to do here at MPD. We're doing everything we can to make sure that people that want to ask questions have a forum and a platform to ask questions.
Absolutely. Thank you. Director Barber.
Yes, and again, the same thing, like I was saying, the dialogue is so important. But, dialogue with constant explanation is not really useful until you understand the perception of the people that you're talking to. And so, and it really has to go both ways, is that we need to understand the perceptions and not automatically get defensive about our policy and procedure, and at least look and see what do they believe our policy and procedure is, and then proceed with review of policy and procedure. But we also ask that other people that are on the other side of this that really do think that law enforcement has something to hide, to really understand, to learn to look from our perception too, and what it is that law enforcement sees and what we see inside that yellow crime scene tape, and how do we together make our community safer. And I said this earlier, what tactics and strategies are acceptable for us to do a better job.
Exactly. How about you, U.S. Attorney Moore, please? Where do we go from here?
Well, same thing that you've been hearing. I'll just tell you my own experience as being the U.S. Attorney in Mobile for the last 3 years is these folks that you've been talking to this evening, they are committed to listening. They have been in dialogue with the community. This won't be new. The reality is, though, that we apparently have not listened well enough. And so my commitment is to find the right forum so we can all come together, know who needs to be at the table. And we, as Jim Barber just said, we don't need to just talk and deliberate. We need to figure out what will work and will be not only perceived to be most fair, but will actually be most fair in terms of law enforcement for all of our citizens.
Thank you. Sheriff Cochran?
We're just going to end it.
Well, I've long advocated reform in law enforcement. We know what our problems are, but we just don't get the support to help us reform it. We need to move from minimum standards to maximum standards, and that attrition that Chief Barber talked about. When they hire or lose 60 officers a year, you hire 60 more, and what happens? You get 2 or 3 bad apples come in the door. It takes you a couple of years to weed them out, but in the meantime, you've lost 60 more officers. You got to hire them. We've got to stop the attrition, raise our minimum standards, and I've long advocated for a national commission on law enforcement, and I hate to see this type thing force it, but it's long overdue. And of course, I'm working with one of our representatives. President Trump did appoint a commission a year or so ago, and Sheriff Santiago from up near Birmingham is on it, and I'm communicating with him with recommendations that we can improve law enforcement. We know we've got bad apples.
Thank you for sharing. President Clopton, would you like to say a final word?
Yeah, to have these type of conversations, they're really difficult, and they're difficult for everyone. The perceptions Different people perceive it in different manners, but however, as the sheriff said, there has to be reform.
Mhm.
But then again, the reform has to be complete to the extent that it addresses the chokeholds. Don't get me wrong. When it's life-threatening, any way you can to de-escalate or get out of a situation, you're going to do it. I'm human myself. However, it should not be a first resort. We have to require de-escalation. It should be a requirement that there should be a warning before the actual shooting. There should be a duty for a policeman or any law enforcement to intervene when it's inappropriate. I would also, I would ban all shootings into vehicles if it was me, and I do recommend it. And require the use of force continuum. That's just a couple of things, and we could all go home, but I want to first thank each and every one of you for your time this afternoon, for your questions, your input, because as everyone has said, we have to have communication. Someone has to listen. It's a difference between hearing and listening. And then there's a difference in processing and overlooking as well. But we have to get or try to understand, and again, build that bridge that crosses that ever expanding stream between law enforcement and the Black community.
All right, thank you so much. I know that it's now after 7, and we do have a lot of citizen feedback questions coming in via Facebook, and I'm not sure if many of you would like to stick around maybe for 5 extra minutes to answer at least 1 or 2 questions from citizens. If so, yes, thank you. And if you have to jump off, we definitely understand.
We greatly appreciate you being here and your openness. Thank you so much. We do hope you can stay for a few minutes.
All righty. And one of the questions that we received, I know that you all mentioned that a little bit during the closing statements, but one of the main questions that we noticed a lot in our feeds, a lot of people asking what is being done to weed out the bad cops or the bad ones in the police force. And on the sheriff department, Chief Batiste, Sheriff Cochran, you guys can jump in to answer that.
I think what the sheriff said earlier is that, one, if people feel like they have been wronged by law enforcement, they need to make the complaint, because sometimes you don't get the trigger with the first incident that occurred. There may not be sufficient enough evidence or information to proceed in the investigation. But if you have repetitive complaints against the same officer over and over again, red flags go off as a result of that. And so again, people have to feel empowered to at least make the report. They can't just say, I was afraid that there was going to be retaliation by law enforcement. They have to be empowered enough to make the complaint so that we can start seeing the telltale signs of maybe that's a bad seed.
Sheriff Cochran?
Yeah, I agree with Chief Batiste. It's important to report it to us, even if the first time we can't take any action, because it certainly shows red flags. And the old adage, if 2 people have the same complaint and those 2 people don't know each other, and it's the same complaint on the officer, well, that starts to tell us there's something to it. And I've often said that the people have to be the eyes and ears for the administrators, for law enforcement, because let's be frank, an officer is not going to commit an unlawful act in front of a bunch of witnesses. It's more apt he's going to do it when it's just him and the victim. So again, we need the trust of the community to trust us that we're going to do our jobs, and we're going to investigate, and we're going to do everything we can to weed out any bad officers.
I'd like to just add that currently right now, although I can't talk about specifics of the cases, but we have 3 law enforcement officers under indictment.
One question, another question that we have, all of the policies that you guys mentioned today, how can that be available for the public? How can the public have this information instead of waiting for a virtual town hall like this to get this information?
You know, Amber, I guess I'll jump in right here. Already, there's been discussion with Mobile PD that we're trying to assemble a way to conduct a proper and appropriate review. President Clopton hit on a lot of the issues currently being discussed, but it's all under the tagline of 8 can't wait. And so shooting in occupied vehicles, banning chokeholds. And I think that there is time now that we need to sit down and review MPD policy and make sure that our use of force policy, and I think that's one everybody is most interested in, is the use of force policy. We have certainly a lot of policies, but yeah, I think that review process, as long as we're not revealing certain tactics and strategies, I think that we can talk about policy in general of the police department and law enforcement and professional law enforcement of accredited agencies.
All right, we
Amber,
have, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Aquilin.
No worries, I'm gonna hop in here for just a second because I have someone very important to me who
Okay.
has been listening as well.
Perfect,
And,
thank you.
ask one question. His name's Robert Kennedy Jr.
Hi.
Hey, good evening, everybody. How you doing?
Good.
So I've been listening to this conversation for the last hour, and if I had not grown up between Mobile and Pritchard, I would be leaving with the impression that we have rainbows and unicorns. And so I'm struggling here because I know as a first step, this has been positive, but there are some specifics that have not been addressed this evening that I would love to see you guys address at other points in the future when you have an opportunity. The two names that keep running through my mind most with the biggest spotlight are Michael Moore, who actually passed away in 2016 at the hand of an officer. The other name that runs through my mind is Lawrence Hawkins, who died in his driveway in the city of Pritchard. In one situation, you had a white police officer and a black victim. In another situation, you had a black police officer and a black victim. And then when I listened to you talk through the continuum of force and that you did not train anybody to use a chokehold, I think about Shakisha Clemens on the floor in Sarah Land with a hand around her throat, as well as Howard Green more recently with 2 hands around his throat. So I understand this is an important first step. I'm very thankful that you've done it, but there are a lot of people who would communicate with you in a way that's different. And as we continue the conversation to go forward, my hope and prayer is that you engage some of them as well so that some of these specific situations can get addressed. Until then, I thank you.
Thank you.
Question we received via Facebook from Leela Victoria. Are the use of no-knock warrants allowed in MPD?
Can I can't speak on yours, can I? Everything, I done went out on the phone and everywhere.
Hello?
Do you want to sign
I think you're...
spell your name, but do you want to sign back in?
Yeah.
Okay.
One more time for this question. Definitely getting used to our new normal. I'm sure that this is the first for many of us. But one more time, this Facebook question from Leela Victoria. Are the use of no-knock warrants allowed in MPD? Chief Batiste.
All of I've had to look back at that. I have to look at the policy. I did not look at that before I came in here, but typically we don't, you know, we have search warrants where we have to knock and announce who we are in any situation. So the goal is, again, you know, we don't do nighttime search warrants, especially narcotic search warrants. And as far as I think the director might be able to speak a little bit more to that. I'm not really sure if we've used no knock in the last year or two.
Yeah, Amber, I'll jump in if you got a minute.
Yes, you're up.
Okay.
Perfect.
The you know, no knock warrants. MPD doesn't issue no knock warrants. They're actually issued by the court, and so to be executed by law enforcement. And so the threshold, the vast majority of warrants will not meet the threshold for no knock warrants. Just because we're executing a search warrant, say on an armed drug dealer, they will not give you a no knock warrant. There has to be reasonable cause to believe that the suspect inside is very dangerous and armed and is likely to use deadly force to repel an entry. So it's a very high threshold, incredibly high. And I can't say that we haven't used them, but it's been a long time. And again, that is a test the courts have for us on whether or not they will issue a no-knock. But I will add to you, no-knock warrants are very dangerous for police as well as the suspect. And so only in extreme cases do we use or ask for no-knocks.
All right,
I've
thank
not
you.
seen a not warrant in years, to be honest. Now, I don't review all search warrants. That is a function of the court. But I do see the search warrants after they've been executed and they're part of the file. And I cannot remember seeing a no-knock warrant in at least the last 18 months.
All right, thank you. And one more question on our end as far as what we're seeing via Facebook. I think some of the questions we already answered. So if you are just now joining us and you have questions that you feel are not being answered, definitely scroll, rewind it back. I'm sure we definitely covered it on our end. But on that Sunday, right before protesters were trying to make their way onto the I-10 ramp, why did you all proceed to use tear gas? And what was the procedures leading up to that to warn the public, the protesters as they were out there, that that was about to happen? Can Chief Chief Batiste and Public Safety Director Barber jump in on that and kind of explain that? A lot of people had questions as far as how it was handled as they were trying to make their way, I guess, on the I-10 ramp.
So I'll start with that is, as people made their way to the I-10 on-ramp westbound, we put a contingent in place to stop their movement. I arrived at the ramp at some point and tried to engage in dialogue with those that claimed to be in the leadership of that particular group at that time. I tried to reason with them and advise them in particular that they were placing themselves at risk for being victims of potentially vehicular accidents by going on to the on-ramp. I pleaded with them for about 10, 15 minutes. I got on the car PA and announced for about 5 to 10 minutes that if they did not retreat from the ramp, if they continued to try to proceed through the officers, that we would deploy gas. We had created a point where we said we would not retreat any further, again, because we didn't want them to be injured, and we didn't want somebody else to be injured as well. And so as a result of that, we eventually deployed gas. That was a decision that was made by myself at that point after consulting with other people in the command. And again, we took the approach of doing what we thought would protect as many people as we possibly could without creating a more hazardous situation in our community. And again, I know I, on the PA system for at least 10 minutes, spoke out and asked people to retreat from the bridge before we ever deployed gas. And I used the PA simply because my normal voice of shouting could not be heard over the crowd. And I used the PA system to make sure that I was projecting at least far enough back that people could hear what our next approach would be.
All right, thank you. Mr. Barber, would you like to jump in on that? I do recall seeing you down there during that time as well.
Yep, and I had made my way up there. Chief Batiste is exactly right. We had already established that before any gas was used, that we were going to try to provide ample warning, if possible, that gas was going to be deployed. I was in constant communication with him as I made my way to the front of that procession. But you're probably receiving that question because many of the people that I talked to at the ramp were completely unaware of why gas was deployed. I will point out that the gas was only deployed on the police line. It was not projected into the protesters. Reason being is that the only people that actually knew what the police instructions were those at the very front of that procession. The ones in the back absolutely had no idea and certainly wouldn't have understood why the tear gas was being deployed. But luckily we were able to de-escalate from there and begin dialogue to begin to get people to understand the dangerous situation, and then the agreement to move back from the ramp leading to Interstate 10.
Thank you. And I think we're going to go around and do one last closing statement as far as Do you guys want to add anything else to this discussion? Say anything? Have any more questions on your end, Aquilin? I think we are pretty much done with the questions on our end.
Right. We have a lot of questions, and it's too much to continue. This is another session, so just letting you know.
Oh,
We'd
yeah.
love to have you in some way, shape, or form for another session. But I'd like to hand this over to Mr. Clopton to see if you have anything else to say as we close out. And thank you all so much for joining us.
I had computer problems, but hopefully you all can hear me. There was one last question that keeps coming in, and it actually kicked out my power. But it was, why are independent? Okay, I'm trying to. Why are independent lawyers not used for police-involved shooting? That was due to the fact that the police work in the courts, work for the DA, yet when they're involved in the shooting, outside or independent lawyers or prosecutors are not used. Why?
I'll answer that. I have the constitutional authority that's given to me because I'm elected by the people to serve as the district attorney. I represent all people. And as of that, I carry that duty very, very seriously. And it is the duty of the district attorney and my boss, the attorney general, to make sure that all of the laws of the state of Alabama are being enforced. An independent or private attorney does not have that power granted to them by the Constitution. And so it is the responsibility of the district attorney and the attorney general and the U.S. attorney, I'll include Mr. Moore in that, to make sure that the laws of the state of Alabama are upheld.
Thank you.
And Mr. Clopton, I'll jump in also, having been in several of these shootings where DOJ has been involved when DOJ gets involved and FBI gets involved, even the local field office really makes no determination on whether we're right or wrong. That decision is made through DOJ, who sends their own investigators and their own lawyers that do not know me or Chief Batiste or any of us, and may not even know the U.S. attorney. So Main Justice is the ones that take control of that and make that determination. It's not made at the local U.S. Attorney's office or the local FBI office. So I do assure you that their process is very thought out to make sure that there's no bias on their part, just because they know the chief, work with the chief, or anything like that. And so I myself, just so you know, anytime that there's any complaint of civil rights violations, it raises the antennas of DOJ and the FBI, and there's always a determination made on whether or not Main Justice is going to get involved and completely remove it from the local offices.
Thank you all again. I really appreciate you all taking time to answer some tough questions, but hopefully it's part of the healing process as we move forward.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I know many of you are wondering, how can you help? How can you get involved? And if you have lingering questions, what you can do to get those questions answered. And here's some information for you. Follow the NAACP on Facebook. You can get involved with the Mobile Police Department Citizens Academy. You can join NAACP monthly meeting every fourth Sunday, and they have that information if you just send them an email as to how you can attend that meeting on the fourth Sunday, and join community action groups with Mobile County Sheriff's Office. And if you have more questions that you feel you didn't get answered or you need answers, please email the NAACP at mobilealnaacp@gmail.com. Again, that email address is mobilealnaacp@gmail.com. Again, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Amber Grigley, WKRG News 5.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.